We just have such enormous reservoirs of lead that remain in the environment as a result of very heavy use of lead for decades that the lead problem is really going to be with us until steps are taken to address those large reservoirs of legacy lead contamination.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 156th episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing betterment of your brain by any and all means at your disposal, including by being very, very exclusive about what you allow into contact with your brain to begin with. We're going to be talking about that in this episode, neurotoxins, one in particular, lead, which makes this a little bit of an inadvertent follow-up to the lithium episode that we had a couple of weeks ago. Both lithium and lead are elements that can be found in the environment. They both start with the letter L, which I can't help but mention after sitting through all those Sesame Street episodes as a kid where they alliterate anything that they can. And we're going to be talking with Dr. David Bellinger, who we've spoken with before. We spoke with him generally about neurotoxins about 2 years ago, looking at a wide variety of different things that can hurt our brain. This time we're really sort of zeroing in on lead because it's been so much in the news recently. This episode's going to be dropping the day after Thanksgiving on Black Friday, so in honor sort of Thanksgiving. In the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick, some of you might be familiar with this, some of you might not have been, but this is actually kind of like a good brain teaser that's one of these things that you kind of think you know, and then you're like, wait a minute, how's that actually work? But ask yourself, if you are trying to lose weight and you succeed in losing weight, where does that weight actually go? Let's say you're trying to lose 5 pounds. The 5 pounds get successfully lost. They're no longer there when you look at the scale. What has actually happened to the physical matter that was part of your body that no longer is? Where did that 5 pounds go? Think about that, and we'll get back to it in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick. But right now, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So in the main interview, we're going to be talking about lead toxicity, which is not the world's most bright and cheery topic. It's a good one, don't get me wrong, but to counterbalance the mood a bit, I thought I would do a This Week in Neuroscience that is decidedly on the lighter side of things, and what could be lighter than giggling rats? It might be news to you, it was certainly news to me, that rats giggle. Animals do a lot of things that we're not perceptually aware of for whatever reason, and just the same way as dogs and bats can hear frequencies that we can't hear, one of those things that's happening at those higher frequencies is apparently rat giggles. For a long time, it was a matter of heavy debate as to whether rats actually laughed, but apparently the Rubicon has been crossed there. Science is behind the idea that rats laugh, and they just laugh at a frequency that we can't hear. There are also certain characteristic behaviors that go along with rat laughter, like doing little jumps up and down with both feet at once. These are actually called joy jumps by researchers when rats and other animals do them. Dogs and lots of mammals do joy jumps, but in any case, there was a study just published, not on rat giggling, but actually on rat tickling. Not only do they giggle, but they are also ticklish. This is a study from Humboldt University in Berlin, and lead scientist Shimple Ishiyama, who says, neuroscientists are so obsessed with deficits such as depression and anxiety, it's rare to find papers about positive emotions. But the study has taken it upon itself to do just that, and they believe that they have found the tickle center of the mammalian brain. People have been wondering about tickling forever. It was actually written about by Aristotle way back when. Smart guy though he was appropriately flummoxed by the fact that people cannot tickle themselves very effectively, but other people can certainly do the job for you. But now we have proof for the first time that not just other people, not just folks wielding feathers and things like that, but electrical stimulation can actually yield tickling, and not just the physical sensation of wanting to squirm and shudder, but the actual emotional giggliness. Scientists, including Ishiyama, spent time getting to know rats, tickling them enough that the rats became comfortable with these big human hands. Rats, like people, are liable to be afraid of strangers and only really be ticklish if it's around somebody that they're comfortable with. But once that's the case, they start really liking that big hand. They'll actually chase the hand around in the cage, expecting and anticipating more tickling, all the while doing this ultrasonic giggling that the scientists themselves can't hear. The tickle center of the brain, it turns out, is somewhere in the somatosensory cortex, which the scientists would then wire up with electrodes so they could stimulate directly. They could also measure the firing rate of these cells as physical tickling was taking place, and the firing rates would stay high not just during the tickling, but also as the rats would chase the big hand around their cage and giggle. But when they changed the situation to make the rats less comfortable, when they put the rats in bright light, which rats do not like, it suppressed activity in these ticklishness cells, and the scientists could also see in the rat behavior that they were no longer in the mood for this tickling stuff. The same distinction was also shown between the scientists that were bonded with the rats as friendly ticklers and other researchers that were not known to be friendly. These findings imply an unexpected connection in the parts of the brain that interpret friend versus foe, and the somatosensory cortex, which was believed to be a part of the brain that only dealt with pure sensory information.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
It is just past Thanksgiving. I wanted to share a couple of 5-star reviews left by listeners on iTunes, for which we are very, very thankful. Mr. Rice and Beans from the USA said, "You know what's smart? Binging on all these episodes of Smart Drug Smarts. This podcast is packed with tons of interesting info in a neat and concise podcast format to keep the smarts flooding in." He managed to work the word smart into his review so many times, I think he's trumped our announcer in the podcast so smart it's got smart in the title twice thing. So hat tip there. And LSU Frat says, "I love the objective analysis of ways to enhance brain function. As a representative of a large pharmaceutical company, I always enjoy hearing physician opinions on cognitive enhancement. Keep up the great work." And keep it up we shall. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who's been doing the yeoman's work of spreading Smart Drug Smarts around to friends, neighbors, countrymen, getting them to lend their ears. I am very happy to announce that the great Nexus drought of 2016 has apparently come to an end, conspicuously timed up, although really this was just a weird coincidence, believe it or not. But with all this Black Friday, Cyber Monday stuff coming up, it is nice that we are back in stock over at axonlabs.io. One of our 2 supplement stacks, Nexus, has been out for a couple of weeks now, but that is no longer the case. Both Nexus and Mitogen fully stocked up, and almost obligatorily, given that it's that time of year, we are going to be doing a seasonal sale going on for a bit here. A massive 25% discount for a limited time. Not sure how deep into the holidays we're going to let this one ride, but we've got a coupon code up at smartdrugsmarts.com/156. That's the URL for this particular episode. So head to the website, grab that coupon code, and then jump over to axonlabs.io for, I think that might actually be the steepest discount that we've ever had. I will leave that to a true historian to find out whether that statement is true, but going from my nootropically enhanced memory, I am pretty sure that it is. I'm also fully back on the horse with the Brain Breakfast newsletter. Was sputtering a bit last month, did not get that out quite as quickly as I wanted to, but published one a couple of days ago and another one coming out quite soon. I want to talk about my time in Finland last week at the Biohacker Summit, which was really awesome, and also just really awesome being up in Scandinavia. But more on that in the Brain Breakfast newsletter. If you are not yet signed up for that, you can do so at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. And in addition to me yammering on about my take on all things brain related, we also drop in a lot of news from around the web, links to what's going on in the world of neuroscience. So if you're looking for a little inbox stocking stuffer about once a week, do try the Brain Breakfast.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So way back almost 100 episodes ago, in episode number 58, we talked with Dr. David Bellinger about neurotoxins. That was our Halloween episode for 2014. If you've been listening for a long time, you may remember. And we mentioned lead in that episode, but it was sort of a bouquet of neurotoxins. We talked about a lot of different things. And the study of neurotoxins and what can possibly be done to prevent exposure, to deal with exposure after it's happened, has made up the bulk of Dr. David Bellinger's career. He is a professor of neurology at the Harvard Medical School, by the way, as well as the Department of Environmental Health at the Harvard School of Public Health, and he is possibly best known in public, at least, for a 2012 study in which he concluded that 16.9 million IQ points have been lost due to pesticide exposure, mostly in children and mostly due to a chemical family known as the organophosphates. But with all the recent and terrible news about what's going on with Flint, Michigan, with lead in the water supply and a whole lot of people getting exposed, children in particular being very susceptible, it seemed like a good time to get him back on the show. If we were ever going to do a lead episode, now was the time. And in a lot of ways, if we're ever going to finish what we started as far as ratcheting down society's potential exposure to lead, a disaster scenario like Flint might also imply that now is the time, sort of strike while the iron's hot or the lead is flowing or whatever the metaphor may be. So don't expect a whole lot of surprises like the hidden upsides of lead or anything like that in this one. This is pretty much a doom and gloom, but we do talk about the neuroscience of what goes on in the brain, just what a big impact something like environmental lead can be, and if we're going to spend time, treasure, and energy to try to solve this problem once and for all, how those efforts can best be made to actually have a good result. So with no further ado, let's jump in now with Dr. David Bellinger.
The Flint crisis really brought lead back into the foreground of concern about especially kids' exposure to environmental chemicals. I think many people had thought the lead problem had been solved because we took it out of gasoline and it doesn't appear in paint anymore and a few other interventions. But what Flint has really shown us is that the problem has never gone away. We've sort of taken some preventive measures that people need to be vigilant about to make sure that they continue to be effective. And that's what failed in Flint when they switched the water over to the Flint River.
Right.
And for some reason that no one has been able to determine, somebody made the decision to stop treating the water to raise its pH to make it less corrosive. So as a result, it damaged the infrastructure of the plumbing so badly that the water came in contact with lead service lines and so started dissolving the lead. But it's really important to recognize that Flint is not really an unusual situation. This could happen anywhere where similar preventive measures for some reason are abandoned. And in fact, we've seen since the Flint problem came to light, other places have started testing that had not previously been testing for lead. And lo and behold, they have the same problem, especially in schools, which are, as I understand it, are not covered by the EPA's lead and copper rule that requires periodic testing of water. So many places had not tested schools in many, many years. And they thought, well, maybe we should look, and found that they too have elevated concentrations of lead in the water. So we just have such enormous reservoirs of lead that remain in the environment as a result of very heavy use of lead for decades as a gasoline additive and as a paint to line our homes, that the lead problem is really going to be with us until some steps are taken to address those large reservoirs of legacy lead contamination. And it's going to be expensive, but on the other hand, these interventions will pay forward in that once a house is de-leaded, it's going to protect the child in the house presently, but all future children who live in the house. And when all the lead service lines replaced with copper or PVC piping, then that's an ultimate fix. Lead's not going to be a problem through that pathway in the future. So with lead, it's been kind of a funny history since the 1980s when large-scale steps were taken finally to reduce population exposure. They've been tremendously successful. The mean blood lead level of U.S. preschool children in the late 1970s was about 15 micrograms per deciliter, and 88% of children had a level above 10.
Wow.
In light of today's knowledge and today's blood lead distribution is really quite remarkable, because now we know that preschool children in this country have a mean blood lead that's below 1 microgram per deciliter, and only about 2.5% of children have a level above 5. So it's a tremendous public health success, but over the same period that blood lead concentrations were dropping in the population, we were accumulating additional knowledge of how much lead is too much, and it turns out that any is too much. There is no safe level. Mm-hmm. We all have some lead that's detectable in our bodies, and so the implication is that we are all, to a lesser or greater extent, having our health impacted. People have talked about silent pandemics, that the population is so exposed to a chemical that virtually everyone is experiencing some adverse effect, some greater, some less, but we all have exposure at levels that we know is injurious to health. And I think it's a matter of opinion as to the level of evidence one requires in order to say that we've reached the silent pandemic level for a chemical, but I think it's indisputable for lead. And, you can make a case for some other chemicals, but I don't think anybody at this point would say that we're not at that point for lead.
For people who have had lead exposure, whether this is children or adults, other than hopefully having good genes, which pushes the heavy metals out of your system faster for some people than it does for others, what can be done therapeutically after a lead exposure event?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of evidence-based interventions. We do know that if, say, a child has a blood lead concentration of above 45 micrograms per deciliter, then clinical recommendation is that they undergo chelation with, it's usually Succimer, dimercaptosuccinic acid, which is an oral chelator, and that can bring down the blood lead concentration fairly rapidly. In a case of extreme exposure, it can save a life. But there was a randomized trial that was done using Succimer as a treatment to investigate whether it was also helpful in reducing the adverse effects of lead on children's cognitive function. So these children entered the study, had a blood lead of 20 to 44 micrograms per deciliter, and children were randomized into either a Succimer treatment group or a placebo. And the children who received the Succimer were treated according to clinical protocols. Sometimes they got one course of treatment, sometimes two, sometimes three. And the Succimer group did show a rapid decline in blood lead, although by 1 year following enrollment in the study and the initiation of treatment, the blood lead levels of the two groups, the placebo and the Succimer group, had approached one another so that they were no longer significantly different. And the investigators also did different sorts of neurocognitive assessments of the children at 3 years of age and then at 7 years of age, and unfortunately found no difference in the two groups, suggesting that although the succimer did, on a short-term basis, bring down the children's blood lead levels, it did not produce any benefit in terms of lead's adverse effects on neurocognition.
Yeah, the damage was done.
It appears so. To me, provides a very strong message that we can't rely on treatment and secondary prevention. We have to prevent exposure in the first place. That's the best way to prevent there being any adverse effects. A whole nother approach to treatment that we don't know very much about, and it's kind of shocking that we don't, is whether there are non-medical interventions that can help children weather this insult to the brain represented by lead. Because we know that from basic neuroscience research that raising young animals in an enriched environment, which means more social experiences and more visual and tactile stimulation, auditory stimulation, that can have dramatic effects on brain structure and function, very beneficial effects, and not really very surprising. And this has been shown to be an effective therapy for animals that have been given different sorts of insults, including lead. So it seems a very reasonable hypothesis that one strategy would be to make sure that children we know have been exposed to more lead than is good for them be given enrichment experiences that provide the kind of cognitive and emotional stimulation that we know from investigation of other sorts of exposures may promote a more optimal outcome. I know in Flint, people are trying to implement those sorts of interventions for the children who had been exposed. I don't know whether it's being done in the context of a research study. It may not, given the reactive nature of the situation and the feeling that we just have to do something for these children who have been so unfairly exposed through no fault of their own or their parents. So I don't know the quality of the research evidence that will come out of this, but as a public health intervention, it seems eminently reasonable to provide these children with that kind of experience. Although we don't know for sure that it's going to be beneficial, there's a lot of reason to think that it might be.
Is there reason to suspect that a cognitively enriched environment for kids, I guess that seems like it would be useful to any kid, whether they had lead exposure or not. Is there particular reason to believe that a kid that has had lead exposure is going to get marginally more benefit from a cognitively enriched environment than any given kid that you pull off a school bus?
I don't know the answer. Nobody does, as far as I know. What I worry about with lead and other sorts of exposures of this kind is that we ask the question of what factors might make a given exposure to lead more or less harmful to a child, but we don't follow that line of argument into the future and ask, are there differences in the way that a lead-exposed child and a non-lead-exposed child respond to future events in life, whether those are potentially beneficial enrichment experiences or could be other brain insults. And we don't have a lot of human evidence on this point, but we do have some animal evidence that suggests that animals, rodents that were exposed to lead early in life recover less rapidly from a later insult. The study I'm thinking of was animals were exposed or not exposed as infants, and then as adults, a laser was used to induce a stroke, an ischemic stroke, in the area of the brain called the somatosensory cortex. And then the animals were tested on their ability to walk along a beam or to place their paws accurately. And although there were no differences between the lead-exposed and the placebo group on these tasks prior to the induction of the stroke, after the stroke, the lead-exposed animals, they recovered much less rapidly than the placebo group in terms of the accuracy of their limb placing and their balance. So I think a lead-exposed child not only suffers the short-term adverse impacts on brain function and structure, but they're also at a disadvantage in terms of how resilient they will be when they face the inevitable later life challenges.
Sure.
Different medical comorbidities or traumatic events.
Stroke recovery seems like almost the classic example of where the usefulness of neuroplasticity comes into play. Is it fair to say that there's an overall reduction in neuroplasticity in previously lead-exposed individuals?
Yeah, that would be one interpretation of those data. Other people have looked at this question from a slightly different standpoint and said, well, what if early life lead exposure increases the rate of normal neurodegeneration by 0.1% per year or 0.5% per year? And that's sort of like negative compounding interest. Mm-hmm. And it actually produces quite a large difference in terms of how soon clinical neurodegenerative effects would become evident. It may be several years earlier than it otherwise would have been. But we don't know the mechanism for this. There's speculation that early life lead exposure may cause some latent overexpression in adulthood of a family of proteins called amyloid proteins that are involved in the clinical signs of neurodegeneration and Alzheimer's disease. The neurofibrillary tangles and the neuritic plaques that are characteristic of Alzheimer's are the result of beta amyloid proteins and hyperphosphorylated tau proteins, and both of those have been shown to be affected by early life lead exposure. So it may be an example of a latent or a silent neurotoxicity that all appears well between childhood and adulthood, but then the early lead exposure has set up an individual to show more rapid neurodegeneration later on.
Right.
It's a very hard thing to study in humans because the need to have good early life documentation of lead exposure and then to follow up people decades later when this kind of health condition first manifests itself. But there is fairly persuasive evidence in rodents and non-human primates and monkeys that early life lead exposure does cause these sorts of epigenetic changes that may predispose to more rapid, earlier neurodegeneration.
So you mentioned earlier that blood levels of lead are what is typically measured. I imagine part of that's just because the ease of access to blood versus tissue. But does blood become sort of a primary storehouse of lead within the body, or is it equally distributed throughout the tissues, or does it favor some types of tissues over others?
Well, it shows up first in blood. It's absorbed across the gut, and it can be across the lung into the blood. But in an adult and in a child, only about 5% of the total body burden of lead will be in blood at any given time. It gets distributed into soft tissues like the liver and the kidneys and the brain, and into hard tissues because chemically lead looks very much like calcium. It's a divalent cation, so it's known for 100 years that they say lead follows the calcium stream. And so much of it ends up in bone. In an adult, about 90% of the body burden will be in bone. In children, it's probably less, about 70%, partly because children's bones are being remodeled so rapidly as they grow. So it looks as though the lead can move in and out of bone much more easily in children than in adults. But the problem is that lead can also be mobilized from these hard and soft tissue pools by different physiologic and pathophysiologic processes. So anything that alters calcium metabolism is likely to also mobilize lead, so that, for instance, when a woman gets pregnant, the fetal skeleton needs to be formed, and that's primarily in later trimester. And so the amount of calcium mobilized from bone third trimester goes up rapidly, and so does the mother's blood lead level, probably because lead is being mobilized from that bone source. And the same thing continues during lactation, when also there are very high calcium needs to support the nursing. Then there's menopause. There's a little blip in the blood lead concentration in women going through the menopause. Immobilization osteoporosis, where someone has broken a bone and so they can't move. Bones tend to release calcium under those circumstances. People lose bone mass, and blood lead has been shown in some case studies to increase at that time as well. So, the physiology is pretty complicated, but it does appear that lead can be exchanged between these different body pools. And with chelation drugs, they mainly draw lead out of the blood, which is why it's very often the case when a child goes through a round of chelation, you will see a very rapid drop in blood lead concentration, but then it creeps up after a week or two because it's being mobilized to re-equilibrate among all the different pools. And so that's why it's called a rebound effect. Very often then, depending on what the level is, the child will receive a second or even a third or more course of chelation, because hopefully at some point you really do start depleting the body stores. Just because you've reduced the blood lead in a short-term basis doesn't necessarily mean that you can stop there, that you've rid the body of lead.
Is there work going on to try to figure out exactly what's still causing the damage, or what's allowing the damage to not get cleaned up by the body's normal healing processes even after the supply of lead within the body has dispersed?
Well, yeah, the study of lead at a neuroscientific level is a very large literature, and it's been shown that lead can interfere with neuroapoptosis, programmed cell death.
Yeah.
It's a very orderly process. It's not that cells become necrotic and wither away. They're pruned away in a very systematic way following a genetic program, and combined genetic and environmental program. So lead can interfere with that process. Lead causes excitotoxicity, primarily because it activates the glutamate neurotransmitter system, really the NMDA receptor subtype. And so when cells are firing too much, too rapidly, they can die. So that's another mechanism. Lead causes perturbations in all the different neurotransmitter systems that have been looked at in the brain. That's important because in a child, these neurotransmitters neurotransmitters don't just regulate or control the communication between neurons, the passage of information across synapses, but the neurotransmitters are actually serving a developmental function too, and they're helping to establish the microcircuitry in the brain, because it's the synapses that are most relevant to the environment in which a young animal finds itself that are going to be most active, and so they're going to be the most strengthened. And then others that are not very important will actually drop out. We have the most synapses in our brain when we're around 2 years of age, and then they drop out as we get older, which is not necessarily a degenerative process. It's reflecting a greater efficiency, perhaps,
sure,
in our ability to process information. So lead interferes with this process of selection of the synapses to validate, because lead increases unstimulated release of neurotransmitter, and it reduces the stimulated release of neurotransmitter. So it just introduces noise into the system so that the microcircuitry is not as efficient, as optimal as perhaps it should be.
That's a great explanation.
There's a lot of possible mechanisms, and more than one is probably the way it works, and they're dose dependent too, so it depends on where in the dose range we're talking about. But lead is just a very bad actor. It works at many different levels and is an equal opportunity neurotoxicant.
What do we see in the dose response curve? Is this more or less a linear problem where more exposure is more damage, or are there interesting variations in that general rule?
Yeah, well, it depends upon the endpoint we're talking about, but most often with lead we talk about the adverse impact on cognition and IQ scores, where we have the most data. And the best evidence we have is from a set of 7 international prospective studies that were pooled together to make one large study of about 1,300 children. And in these 7 studies, blood lead concentration had been measured repeatedly over time, and children's IQ scores were assessed at a time when scores become pretty stable. And over the range of a couple micrograms per deciliter to about 30 microgram per deciliter, there was about a 6-point IQ drop. And what was striking was that the curve was nonlinear. It was called superlinear, where the decline in IQ per microgram per deciliter increase in blood lead was actually greater below 10 microgram per deciliter than above. The slope never became positive, because lead is never good for you.
Right.
But it looked as though there were some clues from the existing individual studies, but this pooled analysis really was more compelling, because given the era in which the 7 studies were begun, each cohort had a relatively small number of children whose blood lead had never gone above 10. And so by pulling the studies together, we were able to increase that number, and so to get more precise answer. So that study, which was published now 11 years ago, 2005, was, I think, very important in motivating the U.S. CDC to abandon 10 microgram per deciliter as what they were calling their action level at that time, and to reconsider even how to talk about levels of concern for lead. So they abandoned the concept of action level and instead adopted what they're now calling a reference value, which is not health-based. They're not saying this value, which turns out to be 5 microgram per deciliter, is safe. Explicitly say in the documents that there's no safe level. Mm-hmm. But what they decided to do was define the upper 2.5% of the blood lead concentration distribution to identify children who are being exposed to more lead than most U.S. children, and so perhaps warrant some investigation as to where their exposure is coming from. So right now, the 97.5 percentile is 5 microgram per deciliter among U.S. children. But each time the new wave of data from the N. Haynes survey from the National Center for Health Statistics is reported, the CDC will revisit this question, and if the 97.5 percentile is dropped from 5 down to 4, 4 will become the new reference value.
Right.
So it's purely a distributional index.
That seems like a really amazing admission to get out of the government, that there really is no safe level, especially for something that previously was used so much in industry and manufacture. And normally the government seems to be so against either change or extreme pronouncements that just to get that as a blanket admission is really something.
Well, it didn't happen overnight, that's for sure. We've been talking about this since the 1970s, and the CDC did resist for quite a number of years, lowering the value from 10, which had been set back in 1991. It had been dropped from 25 down to 10 in 1991, but had remained there in the last 25 years. But in the face of the overwhelming evidence, I don't think they really had much of a choice. All we can do is hope that we don't have to have the same decades-long fight over each chemical one at a time.
Yeah, no reason to keep stepping in the same bear trap. Tell me about what you're working on with Project Tender.
Well, it's a collaboration that was begun between an environmental epidemiologist, Irva Hertz-Picciotto from the University of California at Davis, and a woman, Maureen Swanson, who works with the Learning Disabilities Association of America, which is an advocacy group. So they decided that the time was right to try to strengthen the ties between scientists and advocates to really try to move the needle in terms of protection of children. So it started out with about 30 or 40 advocates and scientists who met a couple of times and identified the chemicals of greatest concern and wrote a consensus statement that sort of lays out the issues, the stakes, and some of the steps that the participants feel are necessary in order to afford children greater protection. So this consensus statement was published in Environmental Health Perspectives, I believe, in July, and other reports about the consensus statement have been published in journals like Epidemiology and Journal of the American Medical Association. And some of the tender participants testified before congressional staff to try to raise the profile of these issues. And the group is continuing. More people have joined, and there are a number of work groups that are focusing on particular issues. I'm working on lead. Other people are working on the brominated flame retardants, others on pesticides. So it's just an effort to raise awareness among particularly legislators and regulators about the state of the science and what the science permits in terms of the level of support it provides for more aggressive regulatory actions.
It's always tough to get the public sector funding for long-term social investment projects, things like this, where it would cost money in today's dollars to clean up all the repositories of lead out there, whether that's public housing that has lead chips in the environment, whatever it might be. Presumably that cleanup work has a cost of billions of dollars that would come due essentially now if we chose to clean up the mess now, but would result 20, 30 years from now in a population with a higher IQ. Presumably that would have all sorts of benefits across the board. Obviously this is speculation, but has there been much of a dollars to dollars, apples to apples comparison, just how much we're hurting ourselves, not just cognitively, not just health-wise, but also economically by not fixing this problem?
Yeah, a number of people have undertaken that kind of comparison. And particularly with lead, the benefits relative to costs for lead abatement, certain aspects of lead abatement, are comparable to or even greater than those for vaccination.
Wow.
And then, I did an analysis of total number of IQ points lost as a result of different chemical exposures in comparison to the total losses associated with other pediatric medical conditions and events, such as congenital heart disease and brain tumors and iron deficiency. And lead and organophosphate pesticides came out numbers 2 and 3 out of about 15, second and third only to preterm birth. So there are a number of challenges. You hit on a very important one, that it's very hard to get politicians to spend money where the value is going to be realized far in the future. So they want short-term solutions that they can take credit for, and we need to adopt a more generational perspective. But also these exposures are high prevalence but low morbidity for any individual child. And so the reason that the total number of IQ points lost as a result of lead are so much greater, actually for the cohort of 0 to 5-year-old children in the U.S., the estimate of total points lost due to lead was about 23 million points. For congenital heart disease, complex forms of congenital heart disease, the estimate was 100,000 points.
So orders of magnitude difference.
Yeah, and the reason is that fortunately complex congenital heart disease is quite rare, 4 per 10,000 children.
Yeah.
Whereas every child is exposed to lead. And so every child is contributing a very small amount to that overall total. And in fact, of those 23 million points, almost half of them were contributed by the very large numbers of children who have a blood lead below 2.1 microgram per deciliter. It wasn't the children with the very highest levels of blood lead that were contributing the most, because fortunately there aren't that many children in this analysis above 7.5 microgram per deciliter. So that's another great challenge. One of the reasons I undertook that analysis was the question I always get when I give talks is these effects are very small. They're not in the range of clinical significance for an individual child. So shouldn't we pay more attention to problems such as congenital heart disease or brain tumors or diabetes or ADHD? And it's a challenge to get people to adopt a population perspective as opposed to an individual patient perspective, because you really need to look at the impact. It's the total dose to the population in effect.
Yeah, it's like the girl trapped in a well is such a more compelling story than 50,000 people getting into fender benders and getting crooks in their neck. If there isn't one person for whom it's a really dramatic emergency, the media just never seems to lock onto it as much.
Right. And also, the lead problem is relatively simple. We know where the lead is, by and large. We know how it gets into kids. We know what it does to them. We even know what the solutions are, but they're not very high-tech. You don't need an MRI machine, and people tend to want to devote attention to these snazzier, questions, rather than the more pedestrian public health problems that in impact are even more important.
I forget who said this, but some politician said this fairly recently and got in a bunch of trouble. Something to the effect of, never let a good crisis go to waste. The idea being that when the public kind of has its hackles raised about something, that's the time to try to push through legislation or take advantage of that outrage and willingness to expend effort to kind of solve problems when they're right there on the front page. Do you think that what's happened in Flint around lead creates sort of a useful flashpoint in that way, that we can at least try to juice some lemonade from the lemons?
You're absolutely right. And that's the feeling of many of us in the community, that if we're ever going to get anything done on a more final basis with regard to lead, this is the time, because lead has been out of the people's mind for almost 20 years now. But this has really brought it back and illustrated that, as I said, the problem has been suppressed, but potential for a really serious community impact has always been there and will be there until some more complete measures are taken. So, yeah, I think having one of the Democratic primary debates in Flint and having Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton talk about it was very important. I think if we can't do it now, then I'm not sure when it's going to happen. And there are a large number of people now who do see this as a window of opportunity and are trying to organize efforts to finally get this problem over and done with, because it's been way too long.
Yeah, festering for a long, long time.
Yeah, so hopefully that will happen. And also, maybe as a concomitant, people will be a little more receptive to the idea that there are other chemical contaminants that we need to be thinking about. And so hopefully it won't be as long in getting attention to those problems as it has been for lead. In a way, lead is one of the first times that the society has ever realized the potential for something of an industrial product that's ubiquitous and very familiar could be having these silent but untoward effects. And so hopefully people will say, well, if that's true for lead, what about the plastics and the flame retardants in our consumer products? Shouldn't we be concerned about those? And so maybe action can be a little bit more proactive rather than reactive, anticipate potential problems, and stimulate some more precautionary measures.
Are other parts of the world doing significantly better or worse than this? It seems like oftentimes European environmental protection is a couple steps ahead of the U.S. How do we sort of rank as far as paying attention to this?
It's very interesting. It depends upon what the issue is. In Europe, they're very concerned about genetically modified organisms and foods. That's not an issue really in this country, except a small number of people. For a long time, lead was a big issue here, but not in Europe. It's almost like there's some cultural factor that makes people in one region focus on one exposure, but not to another, and just the reverse somewhere else. So in terms of worldwide hazard, there are some places in the world that are way behind us in terms of their focus on the issues. Just to give you one example, there was an episode in northwest Nigeria, Zamfara State, in 2010. It was discovered that in several villages, about a quarter of the children under 5 had died, and the villagers thought it was because of malaria. And this was discovered by some Doctors Without Borders teams that were going in to immunize children, and they couldn't find as many children as they thought. And it turns out that artisanal gold mining was going on, and geologically, I don't know if it's typical, but lead accompanied the gold in the deposits, and villagers were carrying big chunks of ore back to their family compounds and then using hammers to break out the gold, but creating a lot of dust and really contaminating horribly the entire villages. In the end, about 400 children died, and Nigerian public health people and pediatricians had never encountered lead poisoning, so they didn't even have any chelating drugs, and they didn't know how to use them. So the WHO and the CDC had to go in and at the same time time trying to treat these children, also to build the local capacity in the medical community so that they could, themselves treat this episode. So it's tragic. But in the world as a whole, the WHO estimated several years ago now that fewer than 10% of the world's children had a blood level above 20 micrograms per deciliter, but 99% of those children lived in developing countries. So we're way ahead in that regard in terms of recognizing the problem, and testing is not done in most parts of the world. So it's become a contributor to health disparities across countries, not just lead, but other chemical exposures. Many of the countries are focused on building their economies and barging full steam ahead in terms of development, but at some cost that at some time will come due.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Dr. David Bellinger for taking the time for that conversation. Obviously, kind of a bummer. And one of these things that very likely affects almost everybody a little bit, a few people a lot. And unfortunately, that's the kind of thing that humans just tend to be terrible at. We're really good at avoiding the I just put my hand on a hot stove burner sort of problems, but terrible about the I need to remember to eat my vegetables every single day, where failure to do so isn't instantly catastrophic, but just a slow accretion of things not going quite as well. We just got through the U.S. presidential elections a couple of weeks ago here, so there's been a lot of talk about the various ways that democracy might be restructured a bit. This is not really a political stance of mine, something I was toying with. What would it be like to have sort of a dictatorship by actuarial tables and statisticians and people that just look coldly at numbers? What's actually happening? What's likely to happen? What are the cumulative damages? People that are either trained or paid or just emotionally disconnected from actual person-level human empathy, but understand the numbers extremely well and so are able to look at the broad spectrum of society without getting lost in the individual little heartbreaking details about one person or another person. I used the example in that conversation about the little girl who falls in a well and how stories like that capture our imagination and kind of get people all carried away about this one individual's disaster. But from a certain cold perspective, everybody being 5 minutes late to work every day for the year is way worse than having one little kid that fell down a well. But it takes a certain type of heartless bureaucrat to really appreciate that. And it would be interesting if we could find a way of empowering that sort of cold rationality in the government. A bit of a digression there, but I guess just making the point that low-level lead exposure does not seem like the kind of problem that society is very well equipped to deal with as long as it's sort of a low-level background hum of problems. But when we do occasionally get a big problem spike like this, that can be kind of the opportunity to rally public enthusiasm for actually doing something, and hopefully we will not let that go to waste. But now, something just a bit more cheery, if you find mass confusion among public health professionals cheery, in the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
So the last that I checked, and I do not think that the recent U.S. health census data has done anything to dispute this, the U.S. and Australia were running neck and neck, or double chin and double chin, as being the most overweight countries in the entire world. And so given that we're coming into the holiday season now and people tend to eat a lot around the holidays and probably not exercise quite as much, people tend to be putting on the pounds around this time of year and will soon be thinking about getting those pounds off. I figured with this Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick, we'll try to get ahead of the curve a little bit and take a look at a study that was done a couple of years ago now down in Australia, and the study's lead author was a guy named Ruben Meerman, who is both a physicist and an Australian TV science presenter. During the year 2013, he lost 15 kilograms, which is almost 35 pounds, and he found himself wondering, where is that weight actually going? Being that he's a physicist, he didn't just let the thought wander off, he actually decided he would look into this. The answer was not what he expected, and he found himself wondering just how many people out there actually knew the right answer to this question. Not surprisingly, you ask the general public a lot of science questions, and you can get some pretty dispiriting answers, so he figured he would ask health professionals. These are the kind of people who really should know where weight goes when you lose weight. So over the course of his study, he asked 150 doctors, dietitians, and personal trainers where they thought the weight was actually going when somebody loses weight through diet or exercise. Very few of the health professionals actually got this right. And what's really kind of embarrassing is that over 50% of them thought that the fat was converted into energy or heat. Now, turning mass directly into energy or heat would violate the law of conservation of mass, so that is a big no-no, said Meerman. We suspect that this misconception is caused by the energy in, energy out mantra surrounding weight loss, but we've exposed a completely unexpected black hole in the understanding of weight loss amongst the general public and health professionals alike. Now, I'll be the first to admit, I got this one wrong too when it was first presented to me. I got it wrong in a different way. I thought that the metabolites from the broken down fat would basically be waste products of the cell, would get dumped into the bloodstream and essentially peed out at the end of the day. But that's not what's going on. The correct answer is that if you're losing weight, the vast majority of that weight or actually mass if we're going to be terminologically correct, leaves the body as carbon dioxide and is breathed out into the air. For every kilogram of fat loss, a person needs to breathe in 2.9 kilograms of oxygen, which is metabolized into 2.8 kilograms of carbon dioxide and 1.1 kilograms of water. Further, if you actually follow the individual atoms within the fat cells as they're lost, 84% of the mass goes out as carbon dioxide, and the remaining 16% becomes water, which the body has lots of different ways to get rid of. So after Rubin had conducted his study and gotten people's answers right or wrong, he did tell them what the actual correct answer was. And one question that he got quite a lot was, if this lost weight is leaving the body as carbon dioxide, is people losing weight a contributor to global climate change? To which the answer is very, 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 very little. Technically, losing weight is putting out carbon into the atmosphere, but any mass that's part of your body to begin with was relatively recently part of the food supply. So the big net differences in atmospheric carbon that are contributing to global climate change are about fossil fuels, which have been sequestering that carbon for millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years. It's not about the relatively small amount of carbon that your body has been sequestering while you've been carrying a couple extra pounds around. But yeah, weight loss is actually directly involved with heavy breathing. So you're at the gym, you're going on a run, you're huffing and puffing. Each one of those little huffs and puffs is actually getting rid of a small amount of weight. Now you know.
Just say no to scratch that. Say yes to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Join our mailing list at www.smartdrugsmarts.com.
Okay, you heard it. That was the entire episode number 156. Thank you for hanging around until the end. If you enjoyed this week's episode, you want to share it with a couple of friends or just bookmark it for purposes known only to you. And you can do that quite easily. The link is smartdrugsmarts.com/156. If you missed last week's episode, we were talking about microdosing LSD in number 155. And next week, technically, it's the Pearl Harbor Day edition of Smart Drug Smarts, although I can't really think of a good sneak attack episode. So we might go with something a little bit holiday themed as we get into the holidays. We've actually got episodes coming up on music and the brain and also family stuff. We got a really interesting interview I did a couple of weeks ago about the heritability of intelligence. So anyway, not quite sure yet what episode number 157 has in store for us, but come back next Friday to find out. Reminder that we'll be having Black Friday, Cyber Monday stuff going on over at axonlabs.io. And coming out of Thanksgiving this week, at least if you're in the US, just want to give a big belated thank you to everyone for listening, and in this case for listening all the way to the end. I'll be back at you next week, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.